The gun barrel pressed cold against the doorframe of the Dusty Creek land office, and Elsie Winslow did not flinch. She stood in the August heat of 1882 with her kid leather shoes black, buttoned, purchased on Fifth Avenue in New York City not 4 months ago, planted in the red Arizona dirt. And she looked at the man who had just told her that everything she had traveled 2,000 miles to claim was already gone. "Sign it," said Calhoun Briggs, and his voice carried the lazy cruelty of a man who had never once been told no by a woman and expected today to be no different. "Sign the deed transfer, Miss Winslow, and ride the next stage back to wherever it is ladies like you come from." Elsie looked at the paper on the desk. She looked at the two men flanking Briggs, both with hands resting on holsters. She looked at the single clerk behind the counter, who had gone so pale he resembled a chalk drawing of himself. Then she looked at the man standing in the doorway behind her, the one she had not heard arrive, the one whose shadow had fallen across the threshold like a judgment, and something in her chest locked into place with a sound she almost heard out loud. Homer Sawyer leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, as though he had all the time in the world. He wore a dust-colored hat, a sun-worn denim shirt, and an expression that could only be described as profoundly unimpressed with Calhoun Briggs and everything Calhoun Briggs represented. "Calhoun," Homer said pleasantly, "you appear to be threatening a woman in a government office on a Tuesday afternoon. Stay out of this, Sawyer. I would genuinely love to." Homer looked at Elsie then, and something crossed his face that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but sat somewhere in the charged territory between the two. "Ma'am, are you being threatened in a government office on a Tuesday afternoon?" Elsie felt the absurdity of the moment, trying to break her composure, and refused to let it. "Apparently so," she said. "Well," Homer pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room as though the two armed men simply were not there. "That's going to be a problem." She had not known in that moment that he was going to change everything. She had not known that the man who had just strolled into the most dangerous 3 minutes of her life, as casually as if he were strolling into a general store, was the same man who would, 6 months later, tell her that her city shoes would be the first thing to go on the frontier, and be utterly wrong about the resolve. But she was getting ahead of herself. She had been ahead of herself, really, since the morning of April the 15th, when the telegram had arrived at the Winslow family townhouse on West 42nd Street in Manhattan, and the world she had constructed so carefully around herself had come apart like wet paper. The telegram had been from a lawyer named Marcus Prout, practicing in Dusty Creek, Arizona territory. Her father, Theodore Winslow, had passed. He had passed quietly, of kidney failure, in a rooming house he had occupied for the past 3 years while managing a property claim he had purchased from a territory speculator in 1879. The property was 160 acres of grassland on the Verde River, with a small adobe house, a working well, and grazing rights that ran to the bluff. It was now hers. The problem, Mr. Prout's letter had made clear, was that someone else also wanted it to be theirs. Elsie had sat with that letter for 4 days. She had read it until she could recite the relevant passages without looking. She had attended her father's memorial service, a quiet affair. Theodore Winslow had not been a well-loved man in New York, having spent the last decade of his life becoming progressively more obsessed with the territory land he had purchased and progressively less present in the city where his daughter still lived. And she had sat in the back pew of St. Bartholomew's and listened to a minister who had barely known the man say kind and general things about him, and she had thought about 160 acres on the Verde River. She was 26 years old. She had been working as a secretary and bookkeeper for an import firm on Pearl Street since she was 21, after 2 years of teacher's college that had led nowhere particularly interesting. She was good at numbers. She was better at arguments. She had a small savings account, a room in a boarding house on West 38th Street, a collection of serious books, and no particular romantic entanglements to complicate anything. What she did not have was a reason to stay. Her mother had died when Elsie was 12. Her brother had gone west himself in 1876 and was ranching somewhere in Colorado, and they corresponded irregularly. There was no great web of obligation holding Elsie Winslow to Manhattan in the spring of 1882. There was a job she was competent at and an apartment she barely occupied, and a life that had begun to feel, with the particular quiet dread of the self-aware, like something happening to someone else. She had written to Marcus Prout. She had booked passage on the westbound train. She had purchased sensible traveling clothes, though she drew the line at abandoning her good shoes, thank you very much, because a woman's dignity did not require her to dress like she had already given up, and she had packed a leather valise and a steamer trunk in her father's letter, and the deed copy that Prout had enclosed, and she had told herself that what she was doing was perfectly rational. A woman with a land claim had to go defend it. That was simply logic. The train journey from New York to Flagstaff took 9 days, changing at Chicago and again at Albuquerque. Elsie had a second-class compartment that she shared with a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Blanche Hooper, who was going to visit her son in Phoenix, and they played cards and traded books, and Blanche told Elsie, with the serene confidence of a woman who had seen a great deal, that the frontier would either destroy her or liberate her, and that both were preferable to slow suffocation. "That's rather alarming," Elsie said. "Most true things are," Blanche replied and dealt another hand. At Flagstaff, Elsie had hired a private coach. She had the savings, and she was not going to be dropped 40 miles from her destination with a trunk and a valise and no way to get anywhere. And it had taken her south and east toward Dusty Creek through a landscape so violently different from anything she had ever seen that she had spent the first 2 hours with her face pressed to the window in something she was embarrassed to recognize as wonder. The sky was wrong. That was the only way to put it. It was too big and too blue, and it sat on top of the mountains with a careless grandeur that made Manhattan's skyline, which she had always considered impressive, feel like something someone had built in a hurry. The red rock formations rose out of the earth without apology. The light hit them, and the light was orange and gold, and almost too warm to look at directly. She arrived in Dusty Creek on a Wednesday evening, dusty and tired, and with her shoes approximately as presentable as they were going to get, and she checked into the only hotel, a 2-story wooden building called the Frontier Arms that smelled of pine resin and old smoke, and slept for 10 hours. The next morning she had gone to find Marcus Prout. Prout was a small, careful man with wire-rimmed glasses and an apologetic manner that she quickly identified as professional camouflage over a surprisingly sharp mind. He had laid out the situation for her with the precision of a man who had been dreading this conversation, and had therefore prepared it very thoroughly. Her father's claim was legitimate. The deed was registered in the Yavapai County land records. The property was hers, legally and entirely, however. A man named Calhoun Briggs had, in the month since Theodore Winslow's death, begun asserting that the original deed was fraudulent, that the territory speculator who had sold Theodore the land in 1879 had not actually held clear title to it, and that the land should therefore revert to Briggs, who claimed to have purchased a competing deed from a different source. "And is his competing deed legitimate?" Elsie had asked. Prout had removed his glasses and polished them very carefully. "Miss Winslow, that is, I suspect, what everything is going to come down to." She had walked directly from Prout's office to the Land Records office, which was a separate building near the courthouse, because the logical next step was to look at both documents and determine which one was legitimate. And that was when she had walked into Calhoun Briggs, his 2 men, and the situation that Homer Sawyer had ambled into from the other direction. Homer had, in those first few minutes, done something that she found simultaneously irritating and deeply impressive. He had diffused the situation entirely without violence. He had walked in, positioned himself between Elsie and Briggs's men in a way that looked almost accidental but was clearly anything but, and he had talked in that pleasant, unhurried voice until Briggs, clearly calculating odds that had shifted in a direction he didn't like, had folded the deed transfer, pocketed it with a look that promised this was not over, and walked out. The two armed men had followed. The clerk had sat down very suddenly, as if his legs had stopped working. Elsie had let out a breath that she had not entirely realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, though she also immediately added, "though I want to be clear that I was not going to sign that document." "I could see that," Homer said. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was amusement in it, yes, but also something more careful than amusement, something that was evaluating her without being unkind about it. "Those shoes are going to be a problem out here." Elsie looked down at her shoes. She looked back up at him. "My shoes," she said, with the precision of a woman who had been underestimated by better men than this one, "are absolutely none of your concern." Homer Sawyer smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that started at one corner of his mouth and took its time getting to the other side, and she found it entirely too disarming and decided immediately to be suspicious of it. "Homer Sawyer," he said, extending a hand. "I run cattle on the Sawyer spread about 6 miles north of town. My land butts up against your property on the north side." Elsie shook his hand. His grip was brief and respectful. "Elsie Winslow. I inherited a land claim that someone appears to be trying to steal from me, and I intend to prevent that." "Yes," Homer said, "I can see that too." He was 29 years old. She would learn later that afternoon when he walked her back to the hotel and they sat in the small lobby, and he told her what he knew about Calhoun Briggs. He had grown up in Arizona Territory, the son of a rancher who had come out from Texas in 1864 and built the Sawyer spread from raw land and 20 years of unrelenting work. His father had died 4 years ago, his mother 2 years after that, and Homer had been running the ranch alone since then, with 3 hired hands and a foreman named Del Cordova who had worked for his father since before Homer was born. He had known Theodore Winslow, he said. Not well, her father had been a private man, but well enough to know that the deed he held had been purchased in good faith and was legitimate. "Briggs has been acquiring land in this county for 2 years, Homer said. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, turning his hat in his hands with the unconscious habit of a man who thought better when his hands were occupied. "He's got money from somewhere, nobody's entirely sure where, and he's been buying up small claims, sometimes legitimately, sometimes less so. Your father's property is valuable because of the river access and the grazing rights. Briggs wants everything south of the bluff. And he thought that with my father dead and no one here to contest things, the property was there for the taking," Elsie said. "Something like that." "He thought wrong." Homer looked at her, that careful, evaluating look again, and this time she held it without blinking. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I'm beginning to see that." That evening, alone in her room at the Frontier Arms, Elsie sat on the edge of the bed and permitted herself exactly 10 minutes of something that was not quite fear but lived in the same neighborhood. She thought about New York. She thought about her small, organized life there, about the predictability of Pearl Street and the comfort of knowing the rules of every room she walked into. Then she thought about 160 acres on the Verde River, and a deed in a land office, and a man with a lazy, cruel voice who had expected her to sign something and go away. She put that 10 minutes in a box, closed the lid, and began making a list of what she needed to do. The next morning she hired a horse she could ride, though not brilliantly, and rode out to the property with Marcus Prout and Homer Sawyer, who had appeared at the hotel at 7 in the morning with 2 horses, and a polite expression that did not invite argument about the fact that he was coming. She let him come. She was practical enough to know that knowing the land and knowing the people and knowing the territory was valuable, and Homer Sawyer appeared to represent all 3. The property was more than she had expected. She did not know exactly what she had expected, something smaller, perhaps, or more obviously frontier rough. But the 160 acres of the Winslow claim unfolded along the Verde River with a particular quiet beauty that hit her somewhere she hadn't been expecting to be hit. The adobe house was small but solid, with walls 2 feet thick and a covered porch that faced east toward the water. The grassland was dry summer gold, but the river bank was green, and the water ran clear over smooth stones. And the light on the bluffs to the south was that same impossible red gold she had been looking at since Flagstaff. She stood on the porch and looked at it, and she thought, my father loved this. She had not thought that before. She had thought about the land as a claim, as a legal and financial matter, as a thing to be defended. She had not thought about the fact that Theodore Winslow, who had been so absent from her life for the last decade, had been absent because he had found somewhere he actually wanted to be. There was something complicated and painful in that thought, and she did not let herself follow it all the way down. Not here. Not in front of 2 men she had known for less than 24 hours. It needs work, Homer said, walking the perimeter of the house and testing the window shutters with a professional eye. The roof wants some repair on the north side. The well mechanism is stiff but functional. The fence line on the east boundary is down in 2 places. Can those things be remedied? Elsie asked. Yes. He looked at her across the porch. Are you planning to stay? It was the first time anyone had asked her directly, and the question held more weight than its 4 words contained. Are you planning to stay? Not for the lawsuit, not to fight Briggs, but actually stay. Live here, make this the place. Yes, she said, and she heard something settle in her own voice that surprised her. I am, Homer nodded slowly. He turned his hat over in his hands once, then put it back on. Then we should talk about what that's going to require. What it required, as it turned out, was considerably more than either of them had initially articulated in that first conversation on the porch. The legal fight with Calhoun Briggs was the first and most pressing thing. Pruitt filed a formal challenge to Briggs's competing deed with the territorial court in Prescott, and Briggs responded by hiring a lawyer from Phoenix named Alderton, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and a talent for delay. The case was assigned to a circuit judge who would not reach Dusty Creek for another 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which Briggs could do quite a lot if he was the kind of man to do it. He was, as Homer explained during one of the early evening conversations that had become an unplanned but apparently permanent feature of Elsie's first weeks in Dusty Creek. They sat on her porch or on the steps of the Frontier Arms and talked about Briggs and the case and the land, and only incidentally about other things. He was exactly that kind of man. He has already attempted to bribe 2 members of the county recorder's office, Homer said. And he has put pressure on at least 3 of the small ranchers in the area to sell to him and testify that the land boundaries in this county are confused. Can he actually make the case that my father's deed is fraudulent? Elsie asked. Not legitimately, no. The original seller, a man named Grafton Hale who sold your father the property in '79, is dead, which makes verification complicated, but there are records. Your father kept meticulous records. Pruitt has them. Then Briggs is counting on delay and pressure, not on the actual merits. Homer looked at her with that expression she had begun to identify as his version of impressed, which was a subtle thing, a slight widening of his eyes, a momentary stillness in that habitual turning of the hat before it was folded back into his general composure. That's about right. Then we match him delay for delay and make sure the pressure doesn't work. Homer said. She met his eyes. There was something in that single syllable, not challenge exactly, but an attention to it, a noticing. Is that a problem? No, he said quietly, not at all. She had moved into the adobe house by her 2nd week. The hotel was expensive and she was practical, and Marcus Pruitt had told her that physical occupancy of the property strengthened her legal position. She hired 2 women from town sisters named Rosario and Petra Alvarado to help her clean and organize the house, and Del Cordova sent a man from the Sawyer ranch to repair the roof and fix the fence line, because Homer had apparently decided that helping was simply what he was going to do, and he saw no reason to make a production of it. She noticed the help. She also noticed that he delivered it without fanfare or expectation, which was different from most forms of male helpfulness she had encountered, and which she found, if she was being honest with herself, rather compelling. The house was small, but it was hers. 2 rooms inside, a kitchen that was also a sitting room and a bedroom that looked out toward the river. The porch ran the full width of the east face, and she sat on it in the mornings with coffee and watched the light change on the water. And she thought about the fact that her father had sat here and watched the same light, and she let herself feel that complication a little more each time. Rosario Alvarado, who was 30 and had grown up in Dusty Creek and knew everything about everyone in a radius of 30 miles, told Elsie, without being asked, that Homer Sawyer was considered the most honorable man in the county and also the most stubborn one. He turned down an offer from the Southern Pacific Railroad last year, Rosario said, scrubbing the kitchen table with the focused energy of someone who took dirt personally. They wanted to run a spur line through the eastern edge of his property. He would have made enough money to hire 10 more men and buy twice as much cattle. He said no. Why? Rosario shrugged. He said the land wasn't for sale. He said his father built that ranch from nothing, and the railroad money would not change what it was. Elsie thought about that for a long time. She saw Homer nearly every day. He stopped by on his way into town and on his way back, and sometimes he stopped by in between, and there were increasingly frequent afternoons when he arrived with some pretext. A question about the fence, a piece of news about the Briggs case, a book he thought she might want to read. He was, against all of her initial categorizing of him, a serious reader. He had a shelf of history and natural philosophy and the complete works of Dickens at the ranch house, and stayed for 2 hours, and they talked about everything and nothing, and she found that his mind was one she genuinely enjoyed inhabiting a conversation with. He was careful with her. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not cautious, not tentative. Homer Sawyer did not do tentative, but careful in the way that a person is careful with something they have decided matters. She felt it in the way he listened. He listened like what she said was worth storing, worth turning over later, worth responding to thoughtfully rather than reflexively. She had not, she realized with a small shock of self-recognition, been listened to like that by a man before. It was making it very difficult to maintain the professional distance she had intended. She was not here for romance. She had told herself this on the train, and she had told herself this in the hotel, and she had told herself this while she unpacked her books into the small shelf in the adobe house. She was here for the land and the legal fight and the new life she was building, and she had enough to manage without adding romantic entanglement to the list. The problem was that romantic entanglement appeared to be adding itself without waiting for her permission. He noticed things. That was the difficulty. He noticed that she took her coffee with a great deal of sugar and never mentioned it, but made sure there was always sugar on the table when she came to the Sawyer Ranch for the dinners that Del Cordova hosted on Sunday evenings, which were the social event of the week for the small community of ranchers and their families who lived in the North Valley. He noticed when she was tired and did not press conversation on those days. He noticed when she was angry, which happened with some frequency, given Briggs's ongoing campaign of legal and practical harassment, and instead of trying to manage her anger or redirect it, he simply matched it, calmly and practically, and helped her figure out what to do with it. She noticed things about him too, though she filed these observations with a care that was only partly successful. He was quietly funny. Not the broad frontier comedy of a man performing for an audience, but the dry observational kind, delivered without warning in a level voice, that she found disproportionately delightful. He was patient with his animals and direct with his men, and the combination produced a ranch that functioned with a smoothness she could observe even from the outside. He had read more widely than almost anyone she had met in New York, though he wore it without display, and their conversations ranged from land law to constitutional history to the novels of George Eliot with a freedom she had not expected to find in the Arizona Territory. He had a scar on his left jaw from a barbed wire fence when he was 16. He told her this in passing one afternoon when she asked, in the direct manner she had adopted after 2 weeks of frontier life stripped away her last reserves of social circumspection, where it came from. "Did it hurt?" she asked. He looked at her as if calculating whether the question was rhetorical. "Yes," he said, "considerably." "I like that you don't say things like 'not much' when the honest answer is yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They were walking the fence line on her east boundary, checking the repair work. The afternoon was hot and the light was long and golden, and the river was a sound more than a sight, a constant low murmur through the willows. "My father used to say that the frontier rewards honesty," he said, "because there isn't enough time or space out here to maintain comfortable fictions." "Is that why you find my shoes so objectionable?" He stopped walking. He looked at her shoes. She was wearing them as she always wore them, because she had purchased good practical boots as well, but the shoes were hers, and she was not about to be driven out of them by red dirt and everyone's opinion. And then he looked up at her with something complicated in his expression. "I don't find them objectionable," he said. "I find them impractical for this terrain. That's different." "Is it?" "The shoes might go eventually," he said slowly, and there was a quality in his voice that had moved away from their usual practical register into something else, something she felt in the region of her sternum. "Not because the frontier forces things out, but because people adapt. They choose what to keep and what to let go." He paused. "But the resolve, the part of you that stood in that land office and wouldn't sign, the part that bought a one-way ticket and came here and said yes when I asked if you were staying, that doesn't go. That's not a city thing. That's just you." The moment stretched long and warm in the afternoon light. She said carefully, "That is possibly the most perceptive thing anyone has ever said about me." "I'm a careful observer," he said, and started walking again. But he was looking straight ahead with a careful blankness that told her he was very much aware of what had just happened between them, and choosing, for now, to let it be. The 4th week brought Briggs's first concrete act of intimidation. She woke to find that the fence line she had repaired on the east boundary had been cut again, and not by accident. The cuts were clean, made with pliers in 3 places. More troublingly, someone had ridden across her grassland in the night, and the tracks led toward the river and back, and she could not tell whether they were scouting or simply sending a message. She did not, she was proud to note, panic. She did, however, ride to town that morning at a pace that her horse appeared to find excessive, and she walked into Pruitt's office and told him what had happened, and then she walked to the office of the county sheriff, a man named Clarence Watt who was 60 and shrewd, and had been navigating the politics of this county for 30 years. Sheriff Watt listened to her. He made notes. He told her that he would ride out and look, and that without a witness to the actual cutting he could not make a direct charge, but that he was aware of what Briggs was doing and he was watching. "He's pushing on you to see what gives," Watt said. "Don't give." "I was not planning to," Elsie said. She rebuilt the fence line herself that afternoon, with help from Rosario's husband, a compact and capable man named Tomas, who had agreed to work the property for her 3 days a week in exchange for wages she was stretching her savings to meet. She worked alongside him in the heat, learning to handle the wire and the pliers, and by the end of the afternoon her hands were marked from the work and her good white shirtwaist was beyond redemption. Homer appeared at dusk when she was washing her hands on the porch with the grim efficiency of a person past caring about appearances. He took one look at her and said nothing about the state of her clothes or the marks on her hands. He said, "I heard about the fence. I fixed it. I know." Tomas told me. He sat on the porch steps, forearms on his knees. "This is going to get worse before the judge arrives." "I know." She sat in the wooden chair and looked at the river. "What would you do?" He considered this with the seriousness with which he considered most things. I would make it very clear that cutting that fence line is not going to produce the result Briggs wants, not by 1 inch. I would also start documenting every incident formally with dates and witnesses because the pattern of harassment will matter to the judge. I'm already doing that. I know. A pause. I would also consider accepting the help that's being offered, rather than finding ways to do it alone out of a very understandable but sometimes counterproductive determination to prove you don't need anyone. She looked at him. He was looking at the river. "You are annoyingly accurate," she said. He looked at her then. In the dusk light his face was all warm shadow and clean line, and he was looking at her with something so openly and simply honest that she felt it land somewhere it was going to be very difficult to remove later. "Elsie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it, and she noticed, and he noticed that she noticed, and neither of them said anything about it. "You don't have to do this alone. That's not weakness. Out here people survive because they build something, a community, a trust, not because they're the toughest person standing." She was quiet for a long moment. The river murmured through the willows, and somewhere in the dark a nightjar was calling. "My father tried to do it alone," she said, finally. "He came out here and he built something real, and he did it by cutting himself off from every person who cared about him. And you've been afraid of making the same mistake in reverse," Homer said quietly. "Staying connected but not actually putting down roots." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because you fight for this place like you own it, but you sleep in the house like you're still deciding whether to stay." She did not have an immediate answer to that. She thought about her trunk, still not fully unpacked. She thought about the shoes. She thought about the way she still instinctively checked the stage schedule, not because she was planning to leave, but because the option of leaving was something she was not quite ready to fully remove. "I'm staying," she said, and this time when she said it, it had a different texture than the first time. Homer heard the difference. She could see it in the stillness that came over his face. "Good," he said, and there was a warmth in that single word that she carried with her for the next several days like something she was keeping safe. The 5th week was when Briggs played what should have been his strongest card. A man arrived from Prescott with documents purporting to show that the original seller of the property, Grafton Hale, had not himself held clear title in 1879, because the land had been part of a military reservation boundary that had been imprecisely surveyed. If the survey error could be established, Hale's title was void, and by extension, so was Theodore Winslow's deed. This was serious. Prout came to her house that evening with his wire-rimmed glasses and his apologetic manner and his sharp mind very much on display, and he laid the documents out on her kitchen table and explained what they meant and did not mean. "The survey question is real," he said. "There was an imprecision in the 1875 military survey, but the question is whether that imprecision extended to this specific parcel, and the only way to determine that with certainty is to have the land resurveyed and to compare the results with the original survey documents." "Where are the original survey documents?" "The Army keeps survey records at Fort Whipple near Prescott." Elsie looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Prout. "Can you get them?" "I can request them. It will take time." "How much time?" 2 to 3 weeks, possibly more. "The judge arrives in 10 days. Prout removed his glasses. "Yes." Homer was there too. He had arrived just after Prout, with the instinct of a man who had learned to read the signs of when his presence was needed without being called. He was reading the documents with focused attention, turning pages and making the occasional small sound of someone locating something important. "There's a faster route," he said. They both looked at him. "Captain Daniel Cross. He was the surveying officer for this district in 1875. He retired from the Army in 1878 and he's been living in Prescott ever since. He's 70 years old and he has a memory like a legal index." Homer looked up. "My father knew him. I've met him twice." "If anyone can speak to what that survey actually showed for this specific parcel without waiting for records, it's him." "You'd need to get to Prescott and back before the judge arrives," Prout said. "3 days each way on a good horse. I could leave tomorrow." Elsie looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and Prout's pipe tobacco, and Homer was looking at her with that careful attention that she had come to understand was his way of asking permission for something he had already decided to do. "I'm coming with you," she said. Homer opened his mouth. "It's my land," she said. "And if Captain Cross is going to provide testimony or an affidavit, I want to be present when he does it. The judge will want to know that the primary claimant was personally involved in obtaining the evidence." She looked at Prout. Prout actually smiled, which was a rare thing. "She's not wrong." Homer closed his mouth. He turned his hat once. "Then, you'll need to change those shoes." She bought boots the next morning. Good solid leather boots, fitted by the saddlemaker on the main street of Dusty Creek, and she wore them out of the shop, and she thought privately that they were not so bad as all that, and that Homer was never in her entire life going to hear her admit it. They left at dawn the following day, she and Homer and Del Cordova, who came along, because Homer had described the route as straightforward but not entirely without incident, which in the language of the frontier apparently meant something different than it would have in Manhattan. The ride to Prescott took them through country that changed with every hour. Out of the Verde Valley, up into the pine forests of the Bradshaw Mountains, through a terrain of granite and juniper that was cool and sharp-scented after the heat of the lower country. Elsie rode without much complaint. Her horsemanship improved measurably over the first day, because when you are presented with the necessity, the body adapts, and she noticed that Homer paced himself to her pace without making it obvious, choosing a route that was demanding but not punishing, managing the group with a quiet competence that never called attention to itself. They camped the first night in a forest clearing, building a fire against the high-altitude cold, and Del Cordova, who was 60 and weathered, and had 11 grandchildren, and apparently viewed Elsie's presence on this expedition as a delightful development, made coffee, and produced dried beef and biscuits, and told stories about the territory in the 1860s that were by turns funny and brutal, and alive with the particular texture of a man who had lived every year of them. After Del went to sleep by the fire, Elsie and Homer sat up longer than was strictly practical, talking in the low voices that seemed to emerge naturally around a dying fire in the dark of a forest. She told him about her father, not the performance of grief, but the real thing, the complicated relationship between a girl who had worshipped her father and the man who had gradually disappeared into his obsession with this territory, and the strange posthumous reconciliation she had been having with him since she arrived here and began to understand what he had seen in it. "I think I'm angry at him," she said, quietly. "I think I've been angry at him for a long time. And I think coming here was partly about proving something, that I could do what he couldn't do, which was build something real out of the claim without losing everything else." Homer was looking at the fire. A small muscle moved in his jaw. "What did he lose?" "His marriage. My mother died of a fever when I was 12, but they had been distant for years before that. He was already half gone, and me," she paused. "He lost me gradually, not dramatically, just he was less and less there until he wasn't there at all." Homer was quiet for a while. Then, "My father was the opposite. He was present until the last possible moment, until his body simply failed him." A pause. "I used to think I was lucky in that. Now I think, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if losing someone slowly is different from losing them all at once, not better or worse, just shaped differently. Do you miss him still?" She asked. "Every day," Homer said simply. "It doesn't decrease, you just learn to carry it." The firelight was very low. The pine forest was dark and enormous around them, and the stars, visible through the canopy, were the wild frontier kind, innumerable and brilliant. "Homer," she said, "why are you helping me?" He turned to look at her. The question had been direct, and she had asked it in the manner of a woman who wanted a direct answer, and she could see him weighing his response with the care he gave to things that mattered. "Because what Briggs is doing is wrong," he said. "Because your father was a good man who built something honestly and it deserves to be defended. Because you came here with everything against you and you haven't flinched." He paused. "And because he stopped. Because I'm what?" The fire cracked and settled. Homer looked at it for a moment, then looked back at her. "Because I would regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't," he said quietly, and the weight of what was not quite said but entirely meant was so present between them that she felt it like a physical thing. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you said that." He said nothing, but something in his face changed in a way that she thought she might spend considerable time afterward trying to precisely describe. They reached Prescott on the second afternoon, rode into town dusty and saddle-tired, and Homer led them directly to a modest house on Gurley Street where an old man came to the door and looked at Homer and said, with the particular warmth of someone who has just received a pleasant surprise, "Young Sawyer, it has been a while." Captain Daniel Cross was, as advertised, 70 years old with a white beard and the posture of a man who had spent 30 years in the army and could not fully abandon it. He had a study that was almost entirely occupied by maps and survey documents, organized with a precision that Elsie immediately respected, and he listened to their situation with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for his knowledge to be useful again. He remembered the 1875 survey. He remembered the boundary question. And he told them, with the calm certainty of professional knowledge, that the military reservation boundary had, in fact, fallen 400 yards south of the northern edge of the Winslow parcel. The land Theodore Winslow had purchased from Grafton Hale had been outside the reservation boundary entirely. Hale's title was clear. The deed was unambiguous. Briggs's competing claim was built on nothing but a deliberate misreading of an imprecise survey that he knew, or should have known, did not apply to this parcel. Cross agreed to write a sworn affidavit to this effect, and more powerfully, to appear before the circuit judge in Dusty Creek in person if required. He had served in the territory for 15 years, and his word on a survey question carried weight that no amount of clever lawyering could undermine. Elsie shook the old captain's hand and said thank you with a formality that covered what she was actually feeling, which was a relief so deep it felt almost like joy. They stayed one night in Prescott, at a hotel near the territorial courthouse, and Elsie sat in the dining room that evening in a dress that was considerably more respectable than anything she had worn in 2 weeks, and Homer sat across the table from her, and they ate and talked, and it was only later that she realized it was the first time they had been in what could be described as a social situation, an indoor, lamplit public situation, rather than a working one. He had cleaned up. She had noted this with the detachment of a scientist and the lack of detachment of a woman, and the two perspectives were not in agreement. He was in a clean shirt with his hair combed and the sun-worn hat temporarily absent, a man who would have been notable in any room in New York, and she had the disorienting sensation of seeing what she already knew was there with a sudden clarity that was not entirely comfortable. "You're staring," he said in his level voice. "I'm observing," she said. "It's different, is it?" "I already told you it was," he smiled. "That slow one." She looked at her dinner. "Elsie," he said. "Yes. When this is over, when the judge has ruled and Briggs is done, I'd like to take you to see the upper Verd. There's a place I know, up past the Sawyer North line, where the canyon opens into something." He paused, searching for words in the manner of a man who does not often struggle for them and is surprised to do so now. "It's hard to describe, but I've wanted to show it to someone who would actually understand what they were looking at for a long time." She looked up from her dinner. He was looking at her with that honest, careful look, and the invitation in what he had said was perfectly clear, and they both knew it. "I would like that," she said, "very much." They rode back to Dusty Creek in 3 days, with Captain Cross's affidavit in Pruett's hands within 2 hours of their return, and the final preparations for the circuit court hearing in the week that followed. The hearing was on a Wednesday, in the courthouse that doubled as the county meeting hall. The judge was a man named Harwell, 60, no nonsense, appointed by the territorial governor and carrying the wary competence of a man who had sorted out enough fraudulent land claims in his career to recognize the pattern. Briggs was there with his Phoenix lawyer, Alderton, who was polished and confident, and clearly expected the survey argument to be decisive. He opened with a methodical presentation of the boundary question, and Elsie, sitting at the plaintiff's table with Prout, watched him build his case with the professional attention of someone who is looking for the weak point. The weak point was Captain Daniel Cross, sitting in the gallery in his good suit, who took the stand when called and proceeded to systematically dismantle every aspect of Alderton's survey argument with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who had drawn the survey lines himself. Cross was on the stand for 3 hours. He was never flustered, never uncertain, and when Alderton tried to challenge his recollection, he produced from his briefcase a personal copy of the original survey field notes, which he had legally retained from his military service, that showed, with absolute clarity, exactly where the boundary fell. The expression on Calhoun Briggs's face through the 3rd hour of Cross's testimony was one that Elsie found privately satisfying in a way she would not entirely admit to. Judge Harwell's ruling, delivered the following afternoon after reviewing all documents and testimony, was unambiguous. The Winslow deed was legitimate. The competing deed Briggs had produced was based on a misrepresentation of the survey boundary and could not stand. The Winslow property, 160 acres on the Verde River, with water rights and grazing rights as specified in the original deed, belonged to Elsie Winslow, free and clear. Briggs was also assessed court costs and ordered to make restitution for the damaged fence line, which Sheriff Watt had documented with a thoroughness that reflected his own satisfaction with the outcome. Outside the courthouse, in the warm September afternoon, Elsie stood on the steps and held the judge's ruling in her hands and let herself feel it. Not for long. She was not a woman given to extended public expressions of emotion, but she let herself feel it. Homer was standing on the step below her. He had been there through every day of the hearing, seated in the gallery, present without intruding. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "The land is yours." "The land was always mine." She looked at him. "But yes, now everyone else is clear on that point." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had been cataloging for months and still could not fully name, and then he said, "Will you come to dinner on Sunday?" Dell has been threatening to make his mother's puzzle for 3 weeks, and I think he needs an audience that includes someone who will appropriately appreciate it. "Sunday," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He turned to go, then turned back. "I was wrong about the shoes," he said. She looked down at the boots she was wearing. She had worn them every day since they left for Prescott, not because she had discarded the city shoes, but because the boots were, she had concluded, better for riding and fence mending. She still wore the city shoes in the evenings, on her porch, watching the river. The resolve was never going anywhere, he said, and turned and walked away. And she watched him go and thought that she was in a great deal of trouble in the most interesting possible way. The trouble deepened, as trouble tends to, gradually and then all at once. The Sunday dinners at the Sawyer Ranch had become something she looked forward to with a specificity that she examined carefully and decided not to apologize for. Del Cordova's cooking was genuinely excellent, and the company, Del himself, the 3 ranch hands, occasional neighbors, was warm in the way of a community that had been built slowly over decades. She was being absorbed into it by degrees, and she was letting herself be absorbed, and both of these facts were new. Homer was different on his own land. She had known him as competent and careful and dry and kind, but here she saw the depth of what he had built. The way the hands trusted him, not with deference, but with the straightforward confidence of men who had learned that his judgment was reliable. The way the animals moved around him without skittishness. The way the ranch itself seemed to run on a kind of internal logic that was the long expression of a particular kind of mind. She found it profoundly attractive, and then found herself finding that finding profoundly interesting, because she had not expected to be moved by competence the way she was moved by his. One afternoon in mid-October she found him in the barn, replacing a buckle on a harness with the focused attention he gave to any manual task, and she sat on a hay bale and watched him work and said, without particular planning, "My father's house needs a new window frame on the south side. The wood is rotten and it won't hold through the winter." He looked up. "I know, I noticed it last week. I was thinking I could replace it myself." "You probably could," he said, "but you were going to offer to help." "I was going to let you ask." She looked at him. He was looking back with that almost smile that she had learned preceded something he was choosing not to say. "I'm asking," she said. "Saturday morning," he said, and looked back at the harness. She sat on the hay bale a moment longer than was necessary, and then she said, "Homer, I came here to build something, not just to defend the land, but to actually build something. I want the house properly repaired, and I want to put cattle on the grassland, and I want to make the irrigation work better along the river bank." She paused. "I am asking for your help with those things. Not as charity, but as I'm not entirely sure what the correct word is for what I'm proposing." Homer set the harness down and turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that had come out from behind its usual composure into the open. "Partnership," he said. She held his gaze. "Is that what you want too?" He was quiet for a moment that felt enormous. Then, "Elsie, what I want is rather more than that if you're interested in the full accounting." She felt her heart do something complicated and decided to meet him directly. "I think I knew that," she said. "I wanted to know if you would say it." He took 2 steps toward her and stopped with the careful precision of a man who was making sure his next action was welcome. "And," she stood up from the hay bale. She was looking up at him, and the barn was warm and smelled of hay and horse, and the afternoon light came through the high small windows in long dusty bars. "And I am," she said, "very interested in the full accounting." He was quiet for one more moment, that careful, attending stillness, and then he reached out and took her hand, with the same brevity and respect as that first handshake in the land office, except this time neither of them let go. She looked at their joined hands. She looked up at him. He said quietly, "I have been hoping for this since the first morning." "The land office," she said. "The land office." You wouldn't flinch. A pause. I had never seen anyone stand like that, like the ground under them was solid all the way down. She felt something open in her chest with a warmth that she recognized, finally, as the thing that had been building since the day she arrived. She had come here in her city shoes with her iron resolve, and she had thought she was here to claim a piece of land, and she had been wrong in the most interesting and wonderful way. She had been here to claim a life. He kissed her there in the barn in the October afternoon light, with the careful and exact rightness of a man who had been waiting to do something, and was doing it entirely well. She kissed him back in the manner of a woman who had been waiting also, though she would have characterized it as making a decision, which amounted to the same thing. Outside, somewhere across the yard, Del Cordova began whistling something cheerful and completely coincidental. The winter of 1882 came on cold and fast in the Verde Valley, earlier than the old-timers predicted, and harder than most had planned for, and the practical realities of running 2 adjacent properties through a demanding season were sufficient to prevent the kind of extended romantic suspension in which nothing gets done. There was a great deal that needed to get done. Elsie moved cattle onto the Winslow grassland for the first time, a small herd of 12, purchased from a seller in Cottonwood at a price that made her savings considerably more temporary than she would have liked. But the grazing was good, and the river access reliable, and she had crunched the numbers with the precision of someone who had been a bookkeeper for 5 years, and she knew it would pay. Homer helped her understand the cattle management, the feeding, the health checks, the management of the small herd through cold weather, with the patient specificity of someone who is teaching what they actually know rather than performing expertise. She learned fast, which he observed without surprise, and after the first 2 weeks she was managing the herd with Tomas's assistance and needed Homer's input only for the things she had not yet encountered. They rode together in the mornings when the work allowed it. The upper verd, which he had promised to show her, was everything he had been unable to find words for, a stretch of canyon where the walls rose 100 feet in banded red and gold, and the river ran swift and cold and clear, and the cottonwoods along the bank had gone to their winter yellow gold, and the light in the late afternoon hit the canyon walls with the particular angle that made them seem to contain their own illumination. She stood in it for a long time without speaking. Homer stood beside her without speaking either, which was one of the things she loved about him. He knew when silence was the right thing. "I understand now," she said finally. "What do you understand?" My father never came back. Why the territory gets under your skin." She looked at him. "Why you said no to the railroad." He looked at the canyon. "You can't buy it back once you've sold it," he said. "That's what my father always said. Whatever you give away for money, you can never quite get it back, even if you spend the money buying something similar. The original thing is gone." "I think," Elsie said carefully, "that you are a person of very deep fidelities." He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" "It is the opposite of a problem," she said. "It is one of the things I am most—" She stopped. "Most what?" She looked at him in the canyon light in the winter afternoon, with the river running cold around the smooth stones and the cottonwoods burning gold against the red walls, and she said, "One of the things I love about you, if we're being fully honest." He looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that it was almost painful to see on a face that was usually so carefully composed, and he said, "We're being fully honest." He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in December, in the proper formal manner, at Del Cordova's dinner table, which meant that Del and the 3 ranch hands were all present, which meant that, when she said yes, there was a brief but intense celebration that involved Del embracing Homer with the force of a man half his age in one of the hands, a young fellow named Ezra, shooting his hat into the air, and then having to go retrieve it from the porch. She laughed until her chest hurt, and Homer looked at her laughing, and his face was so entirely, simply happy that she stored the image in the way you store the things you know you'll want later. They were married in February of 1883, in the small church on the main street of Dusty Creek, with Marcus Prout and Sheriff Watt and Del Cordova and Rosario and Tomas Alvarado, and half the ranching community of the North Valley in attendance. Blanche Hooper, whom Elsie had written to back in November, sent a letter with such warmth and satisfaction in it that Elsie read it 3 times. The ceremony was short and direct, performed by a minister named Reverend Ford, who had conducted services in this church for 15 years, and who told them afterward that he had rarely married 2 people who looked more like they knew exactly what they were doing. Elsie wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself, with Rosario's help, because the nearest place to buy a wedding dress was Prescott, and she had decided she would rather make something herself than make that trip again in February. She wore her city shoes. Homer noticed. Standing at the altar waiting for her, he had looked down when she walked toward him and seen the shoes and looked up at her, and the look on his face was everything. The recognition, the amusement, the deep and particular affection of a man who had learned to read all the layers of another person and loved every single one of them. She held his gaze as she walked toward him and dared him to say anything, and he said nothing, only held out his hand when she reached him, and she took it, and they made their promises to each other in the clear February light. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years in the Arizona Territory in the 1880s were, but they were built on a foundation solid enough to hold the weight of difficulty without being destroyed by it. They combined the 2 ranches gradually and practically, running the Sawyer spread and the Winslow claim as a single operation while maintaining the separate deeds, because Elsie had no intention of losing the Winslow claim's legal identity, and Homer understood this completely. The combined land gave them better river access and greater grazing range, and the opportunity to grow the cattle operation into something genuinely substantial. She kept the bookkeeping for both properties with the precision that had made her good at her Pearl Street job, applied now to something she cared about, and the difference was noticeable. Homer had been managing his finances with a capable but intuitive system that worked but left certain efficiencies uncaptured. She showed him what she saw in the numbers, and he listened with the attentiveness he brought to everything, and they made adjustments, and the ranch became more profitable in the first year of their marriage than it had been in the previous 5. Calhoun Briggs left the county in the spring of 1883, after a separate investigation by the Territorial Land Office revealed that his fraudulent deed scheme had been attempted on 3 other properties in the region, and he faced charges that made his presence in Arizona Territory inadvisable. Elsie heard this news from Sheriff Watt over coffee at the hotel one morning, and felt something that was mostly closure and a little satisfaction, and decided both were entirely appropriate. In the fall of 1883, Elsie discovered she was pregnant, and she told Homer on the porch of the adobe house in the October evening with the river running full, and the bluffs going their impossible gold, and his face in that moment was something she kept for the rest of her life like a jewel in a box, the absolute unguarded joy of a man receiving the news he had been hoping for. Their son was born in May of 1884. They named him Theodore Homer Sawyer, after both their fathers, and he arrived in the world with considerable noise and opinion, which Homer observed was entirely consistent with his parentage. Del Cordova, who had become something between a grandfather and a general to the baby, held him for the first time with a tenderness that made Elsie, exhausted and triumphant in the bed of the adobe house, think that the territory was right. The frontier builds something, and what it builds is not just land and cattle but people who know how to love things. Theodore grew up between the 2 houses, the ranch house and the adobe, in the way children grow up on combined properties, belonging to all of it, and his earliest memories would be of the river and the bluffs and the light on the canyon walls, and of his parents riding out in the early morning with the mist still on the grassland. When Theodore was 2, a letter arrived from Elsie's brother, Edward, in Colorado, saying that his circumstances had changed. His own ranch had failed in a bad winter, and asking if there was any possibility of work in Arizona Territory. Elsie wrote back immediately and said yes. Come, there is room, and Homer endorsed this without reservation, because he had learned in the years of their marriage that Elsie's fidelities were as deep as his own, and that the people she extended herself for were people worth extending yourself for. Edward Winslow arrived in the fall of 1886 and took to the territory with the ease of someone who had been looking for this particular kind of life for a long time. He worked the cattle with a practical skill he had developed in Colorado, and he and Homer developed, over months and then years, the straightforward friendship of men who are brothers because of a shared woman, and who discover they would have been brothers anyway. The second child arrived in 1887, a daughter this time, whom they named Clara after Homer's mother, and she came into the world just as loud and decided as her brother, and looked so much like Elsie that Homer spent a week in a state of quietly delighted speechlessness that Del Cordova found endlessly entertaining. The summer that Theodore turned 5 and Clara turned 3, Elsie rebuilt the Winslow house. Not demolished and replaced, but genuinely rebuilt, adding 2 rooms on the west side and a proper kitchen separate from the main room, and a sleeping loft for the children that they immediately loved with the passionate territorial dedication of children who have been given a space to call entirely their own. The work took 3 months and she supervised every day of it, working alongside the 2 carpenters she had hired from Prescott, learning the work the way she had learned every other practical thing the territory had taught her carefully, with her hands, and without apology for being a woman doing it. Homer watched her rebuild the house with the expression he had worn since the first day, that careful, particular attention. And one evening when the carpenters had gone, and the children were asleep in the temporary arrangement they had made in the ranch house, he sat on the new porch boards and looked at what she had made and said, "Your father would have loved this." She sat beside him. The river was doing its evening murmur through the willow, and the bluffs to the south were going red in the last light. "I know," she said. "I think he was watching me fix it." Homer took her hand. They sat on the new boards in the old light, and the Verd ran, and the territory held them in its particular way, not gently, never simply, but with the deep and specific truth of a place that asks what you are made of and rewards honesty. She wore the boots every day now. She wore them riding and fence mending and cattle managing and tramping the length of the rebuilt house checking on the plaster. She wore the city shoes in the evenings, sometimes on the porch, when the work was done, and the children were in bed and Homer sat beside her with his coffee, and they talked or didn't talk in the comfortable way of people who have made enough space for both. He had never said he was wrong about the shoes. She had never admitted the boots were better for most of what the territory required of her. It was one of the small and permanent arrangements of their marriage, held in humor and acknowledged in the way of a private joke that contained something real, because he had been right that she would adapt, and she had been right that adapting was not the same as surrendering, and both of them had understood from the beginning that the resolve was the whole point. In 1890, they bought 60 additional acres adjacent to the north boundary of the Winslow claim, bringing the combined property to over 300 acres with water rights the length of their stretch of the Verd, and the cattle herd to over 200 head. And at the celebration, Del Cordova, who was 74 and showed no signs of slowing down, made a speech that was entirely in Spanish and entirely impossible to follow but clearly deeply felt, and everyone applauded. And Theodore and Clara danced in the dirt with the informal ecstasy of children at parties. Edward had, by this point, married a woman named Harriet who had arrived in Dusty Creek with a school-teaching position and an intelligent face, and a way of looking at Edward that told everyone in a 50-mile radius what was going to happen, and had done so with the efficiency of a woman who knew her own mind. She taught school in Dusty Creek and managed Edward with loving authority and visited Elsie 2 afternoons a week, and the friendship between them was the kind that becomes as fundamental as a well. Always there, always reliable, the thing you don't think about until you realize you cannot imagine the landscape without it. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, February of 1893, Homer woke before dawn and made coffee and brought it to the porch and sat in the cold pre-dawn dark of a February morning in Arizona territory and thought about 10 years. He was 39 years old. His father's ranch had become something his father had imagined but never quite achieved. His wife had built something out of nothing with her iron resolve and her city shoes and her refusal to accept a world smaller than the one she could actually see. His children were 8 and 5 and loud and curious and entirely themselves, which was the best possible outcome. Elsie appeared in the doorway in her wool dressing robe with her hair down, which was a version of her he loved with a specificity that time had not diminished, and she said, "You're out here in the dark again." "I'm thinking." "About what?" He held out a hand. She came and took it and sat beside him in the other chair, and he put a cup of coffee in her hands, and they looked out at the February dark of the Verd Valley together. "About the fact that you came here," he said. "About everything that happened from that first morning." She was quiet for a moment, drinking her coffee. A night bird called somewhere in the willows. "I came here for the land," she said. "I know." "I stayed for—" She paused, and he could hear the smile in it even in the dark. "Many reasons." The land," she said, "and other things." He lifted their joined hands and looked at them in the dark. Her hands were capable and marked by work now, ranch strong, nothing like the hands she had arrived with. Her mind was exactly as it had always been, exact and fierce and entirely her own. Her resolve, which he had identified in the first 30 seconds and told her about and which she had been demonstrating for a decade, was not remotely diminished, and he had long since ceased expecting it to be. "I was wrong about the shoes," he said. She turned to look at him. He could feel her surprise in the dark, not that he was wrong but that he was saying so, unprompted after 10 years of their mutual pretense that he wasn't. "What shoes?" she said perfectly. He laughed, which was a sound she had always been able to produce in him with a reliability that he found wonderful, and she laughed too, and the valley held the sound of it in the dark of their February morning. "I was right about the resolve," he said when they had settled. "Yes," she said, "you were right about that." It's lasted," she agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the early morning dark, and he pulled her close with the comfort of 10 years of it, and they watched the sky begin, very slowly, to change. The light came first as a thinning of the dark in the east, over the bluffs that had been the defining feature of their shared horizon for all of this time. Then the color, the particular pre-dawn rose that preceded the gold, that preceded the full, impossible Arizona morning light that she had first seen from a hired coach window, and that had never, in all the years of seeing it, become ordinary. Theodore appeared in the doorway at some point during the light change, barefoot and tousle-headed, with Clara right behind him in the inexorable way of younger siblings who will not be left out of anything. "What are you looking at?" Theodore demanded. "The sunrise," Homer said. Theodore considered this with the critical eye of an 8-year-old. "It's cold." "It is," Homer agreed. "Can we have breakfast?" "In a minute." Clara, who had inherited her mother's direct manner along with her face, said, "Is it your anniversary?" "It is," Elsie said. "Dell said we should do something special," Clara announced. "Did he?" "He said he would make tamales." Homer looked at Elsie. Elsie looked at Homer. The morning light was coming fully now, spilling across the Verde Valley in long bars of gold, lighting the bluffs to their south and gilding the river and the grassland and the cattle standing in the morning field and the rebuilt house and the fence line and all of it. Every acre, every post. Every bit of the life they had built from iron resolve and a contested land claim, and a pair of city shoes, and the particular luck of two people finding each other in the precise moment when both of them were ready to be found. "Tell Dell tamales would be perfect," Elsie said. The children disappeared back inside with the mission-oriented focus of children who have been given something to report, and Homer and Elsie sat in their chairs in the February morning light for one more minute, in the comfortable way of people who know that a minute is valuable and does not need to be filled. Then she stood and he stood, and they went inside to their life, which was theirs, which was real, which was built, the whole improbable, extraordinary permanence of it on the frontier where she had come in her city shoes with her iron resolve, and found everything she had not quite known she was looking for. The shoes were in the cedar chest in the bedroom, wrapped in the cloth she had packed them in back in Manhattan in the spring of 1882. She took them out sometimes in the evenings, not out of sentiment exactly, or not only sentiment, but out of the particular satisfaction of holding the beginning of a thing when you are living so fully in its middle. Homer had seen her do it once and had said nothing, only looked at her with that expression, the careful, attending, entirely particular one, and she had looked back, and everything that needed to be said had been said by that, without a word. The tamales that morning were, as they always were, extraordinary. Del Cordova sat at the head of the table at the Sawyer Ranch house and watched the people around it, Homer and Elsie and Theodore and Clara and Edward and Harriet, who had come over with their own 2 children, and the 3 ranch hands who had been with the Sawyer operation for years now, and were as much family as any other designation. And he felt, in his 77-year-old chest, the full weight of what had been built here. He thought of the morning he had first seen Elsie Winslow, dusty from the ride to Prescott, holding a captain's affidavit and looking like a woman who has just won a battle she was already planning the next one from. He thought of Homer's face in the period between their meeting and their marriage, the controlled, careful, profoundly hopeful face of a man trying not to want something too much in case it didn't happen. It had happened. He thought it might be his favorite thing in a life that had contained a great many good things that it had happened. He raised his coffee cup. 10 years, he said. Homer looked at him. Elsie looked at him. To 10 years, Dell said, and all the ones after. They raised their cups. Theodore and Clara raised their glasses of milk, with the solemnity of children participating in something they know is important without quite understanding what. All the ones after, Homer said, looking at his wife across the tamale-filled table in the morning light. Elsie looked back at him with the resolve that had lasted, that had always been going to last, that had walked 2,000 miles in kid leather shoes to be here, and she said, "All the ones after." Outside, the Verd ran in its old course over its smooth stones, and the bluff stood red and gold in the February light, and the grassland held its cattle and its history and its promise, and the world went on being as big and irreducible and real as it had always been, asking what you were made of, rewarding the honest answer.